first time, and welcome back to those who have engaged our course, One World, One Health, and One Medicine, as we celebrate 40 years anniversary here at St. George's University. Now, thus far in this course, examining this topic of One World, One Health, and One Medicine, we have focused on different areas and elements of health. In fact, the World Health Organization defines health as an optimal state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Today, specifically, as we begin the second half of our course, and in fact the second half of the year 2017, we're very pleased to focus on the topic, the relevant and significant topic of mental health. And to join us to engage in this conversation is Dr. Randall Waiter. We're very happy to have Dr. Waiter, who is in fact an authority on mental health internationally and is our go-to person here at St. George's University as well, especially in the area of clinical psychology. And he has actually participated and presented on mental health topics, but also linking that with the One Health concept at the same time. So very happy to share with you for the month of July in our course for 2017, One Health, One Medicine, but the interaction and application towards mental health. Dr. Waiter, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bedesi. Hi, everyone. So it's my pleasure to come and join you to kick off the second half of this lecture series for the year of 2017, which is the 40th anniversary of St. George's University. My background is in psychology, so I have a PhD in psychology from York University in the Toronto area in Canada. I've been with St. George's University for 5 years, doing a lot of research, working in the School of Medicine and the School of Graduate Studies, working in bioethics, teaching in multiple courses, and carrying out research here on the campus. And so my interest has always been in higher cognition, things like working memory, attention, decision-making, thinking, reasoning, and I'm particularly interested in how all of those things linked together with or work in concert with emotional processing, things like anxiety, what we might call bottom-up processing, and how those two interact. And then how all of that plays out in terms of mental health and behavioral health throughout the lifespan, and how people make decisions about behavioral health, things like what to choose, what we choose to eat, what we choose, whether we choose to drink or smoke, whether we exercise, et cetera, and then also looking at the history of what happens to individuals when they're younger and how that sets a life course and a paradigm for how they process information and then make decisions related to mental health and behavioral health specifically. So today, what I want to do in this lecture is link it all back to the concept of One Health. That's what we're here to talk about. And specifically, I want to bring a couple of things together. So let's proceed. And I've got some kind of objectives I've listed here that I want to go through today. So I think we need to start off talking about mental illness in general, and specifically, let's look at its prevalence, its incidence. How much of a problem are we really talking about? What are we dealing with? And then we'll look at a very brief history and the process of diagnosing mental illness, because I mean, you could do an entire course on the history of mental illness alone. We'll summarize the state of diagnosis as well as the current treatment regimens. Again, very, very broad overview. And then, interestingly, or hopefully, I hope you'll find it interesting, I'm going to bring in an evolutionary perspective and try to understand mental illness from that evolutionary perspective. And then at the end, we'll bring it all together, hopefully in a nice little narrative, and we'll talk about how the environmental approach, the One Health approach really, might be used to reduce the burden of mental illness. Okay, so let's jump in. So what are we really talking about in terms of mental illness and prevalence and incidence? How much of a problem is mental illness? And the first place we can start is looking at a global impact through the World Health Organization. And we can see that about 25% to a quarter to a third of the global population will report symptoms at some point in their life that meet a diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder. So already, right off the start, we're talking about a huge proportion of the worldwide or global population. And we see that 45% of those with a mental disorder meet the criteria for more than one diagnosis in the mental illness realm. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we go about diagnosing and why there's such an overlap. We know that severity of symptoms and severity of illness is strongly linked to this comorbidity, so having more than one mental illness and having other health issues that all can contribute and overlap. And we also know that most chronic mental illness has an onset in adolescence. And so I put in here in the PowerPoint slide, why is that? I'm going to actually throw that, I'm going to leave that question with you instead of addressing it now, and then at the end when we have time for discussion, then we'll come back to this. So hopefully someone will either call in or write in and ask that question, or maybe even come call in or write in and offer some ideas as to why most of these illnesses have an onset in adolescence. And we're specifically talking about chronic mental illness. Okay, so what about in the United States specifically? So when we look at the National Comorbidity Study, this is unfortunately data from 2003, 2004 era, which is starting to get old. This is older data now. Unfortunately, we don't have anything that is more up to date, or at least I couldn't find anything that's more up to date. So we'll have to make do with this for the moment. But we see that in terms of prevalence, 12-month prevalence, 26% of U.S. adult population reports some type of mental illness or symptoms of mental illness. And of those, 22%, or about 5.8% of the U.S. population, are classified as severe. And again, you can see that this average age of onset is 14 years old, so that adolescent period. Lifetime prevalence, 46% of Americans report meeting criteria at some point in their life for a diagnosis of mental disorder, and 50% of all lifetime cases had started by age 14, and 75% had started by age 24. So a couple of notes we take away right away. It's a big problem. It's quite prevalent. Lots of people are experiencing mental illness. And also, it's got an early onset, early on in life, and especially for chronic mental illness. So this is the kind of thing where a lot of people are experiencing it. And because it has an early onset, a lot of people are going to be at risk for experiencing mental illness for a very long duration of time. So it's not like something like heart disease where, you know, it kicks in much later in life, or more as you go through life or age, you're more at risk from experiencing heart disease. And so there's less life lived. You might look at it that way with that particular syndrome. Now, health economists like to look at the impact of illness, and there are a couple of ways to really measure impact, right? So one thing we can do is we can look at years of potential life lost. So this is, okay, if I would have expected to live until the age of 78 or 77, but I die at the age of 70 from a heart attack, then I've lost 7 or 8 years of potential life that I would have expected to live. And so when we actually look at the impact of different diseases on years of potential life lost in the United States, we can see that at the highest level is cancer, malignant neoplasm. So cancer really takes the most years of potential life lost in the US. All others is a category that comes next. That's lumping everything else that's not listed here. But then you can see that heart disease is the next most prevalent at 17%, and then unintentional injuries, suicide, chronic low respiratory disease, etc. So heart disease, cancer, definitely taking the most potential years of life in the United States. But the interesting thing about this list now, unless you include suicide under the rubric of mental illness, you'll see that mental illness isn't really popping up here. And so the take-home message, except for that suicide link, which is a very small percentage overall, is that mental illness doesn't really cause loss of life, right? And so if you're measuring the impact of mental illness from this perspective strictly, then you're really not capturing the full picture, because all those people suffering from mental illness at some point in their lives are really not showing up based on this metric. So the other thing that you can do is you can look at years lived with a disability. So this is, okay, well, the disease isn't really going to kill you per se, but it's going to cause you to suffer, right? It's going to reduce your maximum health, or your health from a maximum level to some level that's lower than maximum. And so here in this chart, we have different types of illnesses, and we have the number of years lived with a disability listed out on the horizontal axis. And you'll see that this is from the World Health Organization, the Americas in red, the red bars, and then worldwide in the blue bars. And so the first thing you're going to notice when you take a quick look at this chart is that neuropsychiatric disorders pops out immediately, right, as by far the greatest number of years lived with a disability. And then you'll see pretty quickly that sense organ disorders, things like loss of vision, loss of hearing, pops out as having a very high number of years lived with a disability as well. And so when you switch that metric around and you look at disability rather than years of life lost, all of a sudden the mental illnesses, the neuropsychiatric disorders really pop up front, and they really take center stage. And so what we're really talking about here is a health problem that really is related to suffering, pain and suffering among those who are experiencing mental illness. Now on this chart, what we've done is we're breaking it down in those neuropsychiatric, that neuropsychiatric disorders category, and we're looking at different mental illnesses. And so you've got unipolar, bipolar, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, et cetera, et cetera. And the first thing you'll notice with this one is that unipolar depression pops out as far and away the most years lived with a disability. So again, the WHO Americas region is in red, and the worldwide is in blue. And so far and away, unipolar depression is number one. And then we kind of have a little bit of a tie going on between Alzheimer's disease, dementias, alcohol use disorders, and schizophrenia. And we would think, or we would surmise, that going forward, especially with aging populations, the Alzheimer and other dementias category is going to increase significantly and likely take the second place pretty soon, if it hasn't already. So again, this data is from 2004. It's a little bit outdated, so we do need more data, or newer data that I just wasn't able to locate, or doesn't exist at this time. So this is a nice little graphic that kind of describes how we can combine this idea of years lost, years of life lost, with years lived with a disability. And this is the disability adjusted life years measure. And so what we do is we account for number of years lived in maximal health, number of years lived in less than maximal health, or with a disability or disease. And then we also factor in the number of years of life lost. So if you die of a heart attack at the age of 60 or 70, and you would have lived till 77, that comes into account. And then also we see from this graphic that essentially you tend to start off the most healthy that you'll probably be in early life, and then as you age, you have more intermittent periods of years lived with a disability until eventually death. So when we look at worldwide disability-adjusted life year measures, and this is undiscounted and non-age weighted. So you can weight the years in earlier life higher than you can at later life, but we'll ignore that for the moment. We see that, first of all, the greatest number of dailies worldwide are still accounted to infectious and parasitic diseases. And I believe next month you're going to have a lecture from the president of the St. George's University on the impact of parasitic diseases and One Health perspective. And then you see we've got almost a little bit of a tie between perinatal conditions and cardiovascular diseases. But then coming in a little bit of a tie maybe in third place, but unintentional injuries like traffic accidents, and then that's followed very, very closely by neuropsychiatric disorders. So from that combined measure where we look at years of life lost and disability, it looks like neuropsychiatric disorders are coming in somewhere around fifth place in terms of worldwide global impact or impact of illness. So to sum up this whole section then, what we're really looking at is a fairly significant group of illnesses that impact a lot of people. Doesn't necessarily lead to death except in cases where severe suicide results in or severe depression or other illnesses lead to suicide. But it does impact people in terms of the quality of life and how much suffering is taking place. So then we can finish off and we can look at the cost. So this is in the United States in 2011, and the top 10 most expensive medical conditions are listed here. So we have absolute costs in terms of millions of dollars, and then we have relative costs in terms of percentage of overall medical expenses. And so the first thing that pops out here, you can see at the very bottom, is heart conditions are a major impact in terms of cost in the United States, followed by cancer and trauma-related disorders, things like car accidents and falls, etc. But then you'll see number 4, and it's pretty close to trauma, it's not far behind cancer, again, is mental disorders. So if we want to look past the human condition associated with mental illness and just strictly take a cold hard look at the costs associated with mental illnesses, we can see that it doesn't really change much. It's also an extremely expensive set of diseases to try and treat or to address. At least in the United States, I would suspect that this would be very similar in most developed countries. Might not be as high in developing countries simply because there tends to be a lack of resources for treating many mental illnesses in developing countries. Okay, so that is the end of the impact section of mental illness. Let's switch gears a little bit and look at a very brief history of how people have tried to understand mental illness and where we are today and how we've gotten to where we are today along that path. So the interesting thing that as we go through this, you'll find, hopefully you'll find, ties all of this together, is this idea that no matter what we're seeing in the environment around us, simply because of the way that the human brain has evolved, we're predisposed to come up with hypotheses or explanations for the things we see around us. And so as we go through all of this, you'll notice that there are always explanations for phenomenon. So people are always looking for why they're noticing things in the environment or why people are behaving a certain way. Now, that doesn't mean that those explanations are always accurate or correct, right? But they do usually exist. So, and those explanations are usually impacted by cultural beliefs or worldviews or the pre-existing zeitgeist of the time, right? So when we go back to the ancient world, we start to see things like, and by ancient world I'm talking 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we have evidence that mental illness was often seen as things like metaphysical possession, demonic possession, spiritual possession. Some postulated that there was an imbalance in body fluids or an imbalance in energy in the body, like yin-yang theory on traditional Chinese medicine. And so treatment then, because treatment is usually directly impacted by your paradigm of what's causing the illness, took the form of things like exercise, bloodletting, surgery on the skull. This is called trephining, and I've got an image here of what we believe were holes punctured through the skull to release spirits or demons that were possessing the individual. Incantations, exorcism, torture, etc., etc. And we find that so pretty crude, rudimentary treatments. Many patients just lived with families or wandered around or found, rare refuge where they could. As we moved into the Middle Ages, again, remembering that the zeitgeist of the time often influences how we approach treatment, then we can see that in Middle Ages in Europe, causes for mental illness were seen as divine intervention for the individual, or perhaps diabolical or magical or transcendental. Perhaps individuals who are suffering from mental illness were being punished for sins, or their faith was being tested, or their character was being tested. And so the therapies for those types of things were things like prayer, fasting, exorcism by those who may have been possessed by the devil, and religious orders, which were so important during the Middle Ages, often took control over these types of treatments. And even to the, hallucinations could be seen as spiritual and visionary insights. Again, the zeitgeist of the time and the importance of religious orders during that time. And then something happened, so then the Renaissance came up, and this idea of examining the natural world and the Enlightenment, right? So by the 1700s, mental illness was starting to be seen more as an organic physical phenomenon that could be treated, much like the body was viewed as an organic machine that we can pull apart and we can understand how it works. And so mental illness, which takes place in the body inside individuals, is essentially should react to the same rules. So we can look at the mechanistic or the mechanisms of mental illness and try to understand how we can address them. So we see a diminishing impact of this idea of demonic possession or moral responsibility, or someone's being tested, their souls being, or their characters being tested, and more of this movement toward understanding, classifying, starting to tease apart to understand the mechanisms. And then we get into the 1800s, when there was this evolution of treatment that looked at more moral treatment of patients, putting them in asylums where they could be monitored more carefully, further focus on the scientific inquiry of mental illness following the great success that was seen in physics through the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And then as it was almost like we got ahead of ourselves, and it was this this issue of, okay, we've got the methodologies, and we're starting to look at the body as a biological machine or mechanism, and we can pull it apart and look at it. And then we started to what I call the moralist or dark period, where we started to really poke and prod without much ethical guidance or moral guidance. And this is through the early 1920s into the 1950s. So this is where we saw things like the Nazi experiments in World War II, where we saw the Tuskegee study in the United States. So this was really kind of a dip, if you will, or a little bit of a dark period. And then when we got into Well, the good thing about this period was that President Truman passed the National Mental Health Act to form the National Institutes of Mental Health. So the importance of mental health and treating mental health was seen. It's just that we needed a few more decades to catch up so that our ethics could catch up to what we were doing in terms of experimentation and research. And then through the 1950s into the 1980s, remember, we had this pharmaceutical explosion. And so psychotropic medications were developed, and this really revolutionized the way that we treated mental illness. So the idea was to get individuals out of the institutions. If we can treat them with medications, we can control the symptoms, they can be out in society, they can be productive members of society. And so from 1955 to 1990, the population of patients in mentally ill hospitals dropped from about 500,000 to about 100,000 people. And so you had this massive group of individuals who were basically who came back out into society, onto the streets. And this caused some problems because if people stop taking their medications, then the symptoms aren't kept under control. And so there was still, the mental illness was still there. And so local mental health homes and facilities had to try to pick up the burden of that open release of patients. And then from about 2000 onward, we're really starting to see mental illness as a social welfare concern, I think, and this is the next evolution where now we're looking at, okay, well, medications are important, but what other things can we do to provide for people with serious mental illness to make them productive and full members of society and to support them any way that we can. So that's our history. What about diagnosing mental illness? Because, of course, this is an important piece. How do we determine who's mentally ill, who needs help, who isn't? And the worrisome thing, or the challenging thing about diagnosis, is that it's still not 100% science. There's still some art to it. And there's an ongoing debate about how we go about diagnosing mental disorders. So, for example, these are two major institutions in the United States, the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. And if you go, at least the last time I went on their websites to look up mental illness, these are the definitions that each institution provides. And they're pretty different. So you look at the National Institutes of Health, mental illness defined as a disruption in neural circuits. Okay, so pretty straightforward, pretty simple definition, which is mental illness referring to disorders generally characterized by dysregulation of mood, thought, and or behavior as recognized by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Association. And so the CDC, I don't know if I would call it a cop-out, but essentially what they're saying is, well, mental illness is whatever the American Psychiatric Association says mental illness is, because they all got together and wrote the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That seems a little bit circular to me. At least the National Institutes of Health is defining it without having to rely to what are sometimes subjective diagnostic criteria and simply calling it a disruption in neural circuits. Now, the downside to that is that it doesn't really give you much to go on in terms of understanding what. That's where we're at, and that's the state. So this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Sorry, I'm just going to grab some water.
And this is released by the American Psychiatric. The DSM-5 was just written recently, so it's fairly new. And when we look at the DSM, what we're trying to, or what it lays out, diagnosis is that, first of all, you have to have clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern of behavior. And that has to be associated with distress, disability, or impairment in function of some sort. Expectancy sanctioned response to an event, like say if someone's parent dies or their child is killed in an accident, of course they're going to be upset and distressed and distraught. And it reflects behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction. Right? So, pretty wide brush that's being wielded there. And when we actually look at the diagnosis, then it's also highly related to the causes and risk factors, right? And this is part of the reason it's so complicated, is because we really don't yet know, or we don't have a mental illness. It's a very complex phenomenon. So when we're looking at causal relationships, we have to account for things like multiple variables in the environment that can all come into play. So the individual genetic, whatever they're born with, their personality factors, what happens to them when they're young in terms of relationships, and also how they process information, how stressful is their current environment. And then we have to look at how all those things can feed into each other, and then we have to look at circularity, because someone who is predisposed to depression, some stressful trigger in the environment can trigger them into a depressive episode, which then patterns of thinking. So then they start to see the negative in everything, so they start to actually pull out more negative examples that they're seeing, and trying to pull out positive things that are in, which continue circularity that is critically important that takes place. So the best
Hey, Dr. Wachter, can you hear me? This is John.
Model that we have, I think, for understanding risk for mental illness at this time is the diathesis structure. And so diathesis is a necessary or contributory cause that is not sufficient to cause the disorder. And you have to have, so it's kind of like a predisposition. It's setting you up, and then you have to have some kind of trigger to basically launch a mental illness episode, and that is component. So the response of an individual to demands that are perceived as taxing. And so on the next slide, I've got a nice little chart that lays all of this out when we're trying to understand, okay, what makes certain individuals really susceptible to mental illness and others not, right? And so we know, you probably know people yourself. So some people just seem to be really robust. They might go into little depressive episodes, but then they bounce back quickly. Other people are really, really susceptible, so they can go on for weeks at a time with a mental illness episode, and then it's chronic, so they might come back and then they'll dip down again. And so how do we really understand what's going on, link all this together and create a model? And so the diathesis stress model along the vertical axis you'll see is a probability of, in this case, depression. And then along the horizontal axis we have level of stress. Okay? So that if you've got a probability, so you've got a diathesis or a predisposition that is very low, depression, and so in this case the blue line, and you're under a low level of stress, you're not going to see very much depression. It's very, very low probability of depression. But if, as the stress level in the environment ramps up, then even someone with no diathesis, with no predisposition, eventually they're going to reach their breaking point, right? So someone who's super, super resilient, you put them into an absolutely crazy stressful environment and you leave them there, or you take them in and out and you keep exposing them to that, eventually something's going to give. They're going to have some type of mental illness or some type of episode. Now, that's the blue line. Now, what happens when you've got someone with a diathesis or predisposition for mental illness is it basically shifts the line up. So even at very low levels of stress, you can see that those people still have a pretty high probability of experiencing depression. In this case, it's about a third up the probability scale on the vertical axis. And then what happens is, so you expose those people to stress, and they ramp up as well. But you'll see that by the time they get to like a medium to medium-high level of stress, their probability of experiencing depression or mental illness is very, very high. So they're more likely to cross that threshold. They're more likely to cross it earlier as that stress level builds up. And so this is how we can kind of link or understand where people fall on this kind of spectrum of risk, if you will, for mental illness. And this is important because when we come back to talking about the One Health concept and the environmental concept, this will start to really make sense. Okay, so causes and risk factors. Sorry, I'm just going to, here we go. Okay, so when we're looking at different causal mechanisms, what we try to do is set up our viewpoints, our paradigms, and what that really does is it helps professionals to organize their observations and provide systems of thought. And more recently, we're really trying to combine models as much as we can to understand that multiple variables and factors come into play all at the same time. And so traditionally, you know, you would have your biological psychologist or your biologist who would look at how the body functions. You have your geneticists who are looking at the genes that you inherit and how those predispose you to mental illness. You would have your behaviorists who would look at, okay, well, what's happening in the environment, or your social psychologists, and how does that influence mental illness. You would have your cognitive psychologists who would look at the way the individual processes information and how does that play out in terms of mental illness. And so when we try to combine all of those things together, we end up with the biopsychosocial model of health, right? And so you've got the biology, things like physical health, disability, genetic vulnerabilities. You have the psychological realm, coping skills, social skills, IQ, temperament, and then you've got the social realm, things like your social network, your peers, your family, and what school you go, and all of that combines together. And in the middle, we have the mental health factor, right? And so biology intermixes with psychology to determine temperament, personality, IQ. Biology intermixes with the social system effects, and then family systems, family relationships as social, logical, and trauma and close relationships, and how that all plays out. And so the biopsychosocial is our current attempt at bringing this together. It's not without its flaws. So no particular theory in this model really addresses the entire spectrum of abnormality. And many have adopted an eclectic approach, which doesn't really can't really be addressed by the theories that are laid out. So we do the best we can. And why is cause so important? Because, again, remember that your perspective on what causes the mental illness directly impacts on how you're going to treat the mental illness, right? So again, if you believe that someone who is suffering from mental illness has been possessed by the devil, then you're going to need something supernatural to get the devil out of them, right? An exorcism or that type of thing, rather than prescribing them a medication, or going for a walk, or reducing stress in their environment, something like that. That's not going to get rid of the demon that's possessing them. And so when we look overall at our treatment system that is currently in place, there are a couple of kind of things we can take away from that at the 30,000-foot perspective. So the first thing is that mental illness, remember, when we think back to the costs, it's a very costly to treat, and costly to address, because it has low mortality. And that's kind of a counterintuitive thinking. But the idea is, if you develop or are susceptible to chronic mental illness, it's probably not going to kill you, and it's going to really kick in at a very early age. So that means you're going to live decades with your syndrome, whatever that might be, and that means you're going to need treatment for decades. And so those costs over time really start to add up. We have, this issue of, okay, how do we tease apart personality from mental illness, and how does personality play in to mental illness? And that's important because some personality disorders are notoriously difficult to treat, let alone cure. And so sometimes that's just the way people are set when you look at the big 5 personality factors, and that can have a significant impact on an individual's outlook on life, how they process information, and that then has an impact on mental illness and well-being. So think of something like the neurotic personality, which is very negative bent, which is like, everybody's out to get me, I'm a victim, life is bad, there's nothing good. Those individuals tend to really focus on all the negatives in life, and you can see how that can really start to stress you out and weigh you down. Mental illnesses with a clear genetic component, I've given the example here of bipolar disorder, do respond much better to treatment, like drugs. But we don't have a lot of mental illnesses with very clear genetic components. There are certainly genetic contributors, but again, think of that diathesis stress model where there are examples of people who have predisposition, but they never really go on to experience much chronic mental illness. There are very few quote-unquote cures for mental illnesses. So when I talk about a cure, I'm talking about things like a vaccine, which means you'll never get polio, for example, or you take an antibiotic to get rid of a biotic infection, that type of thing. And most treatments reduce symptoms and minimize impact on daily functioning, but they don't get rid of the underlying cause or causes of the mental illness themselves. When we look at the social impact, we see that not all people receive treatment. It's mostly on an outpatient basis, and inpatient hospitalization now usually takes place in the psychiatric units of general hospitals rather than specialized psychiatric hospitals. And then we see often substantial delays unless the individual has the monetary resources to see private practitioners. And there are ways to work the system which can make it unfair. So if you really want to be seen for a mental health issue and you fear that you'll be put on a waiting list for a very long period of time, just walk into any emergency department, tell them you're going to kill yourself, and provide a concrete plan, even if you aren't, and you will be seen immediately. They have to treat you immediately. They can't just let you walk away or delay you or turn you down for treatment. Treatment regimen depends on the causal perspective. I've mentioned this, so whether we're approaching it from the medical or the psychodynamic or the behavioral perspective. So when we look at the 2 major categories of treatment, we're really looking at somatotherapy, which is a biological-based treatment, or we're looking at psychotherapy, which is more psychologically based treatment. So somatotherapy, these are things like psychiatric medications, anti-anxieties, your antidepressants, your antipsychotics, your mood stabilizers. It can include electromagnetic therapy or psychosurgery. And so these are all the things that we're basically looking at changing the biology of the individual in some way or impacting the biology of the individual to reduce symptoms of mental illness. Psychotherapy is more, like I mentioned, about the psychology of the individual. So these are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, gestalt therapy, interpersonal and family dynamic therapy, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So there's a nice little circular graph in here where something happens, you have a cognitive appraisal, that leads to an emotion, and then that impacts your behavior, which then gets you focusing on certain things in your environment or changing the way you behave, which then impacts your cognitive appraisal, and around we go. Okay, what about ethical legal concerns? Because there are many here. I'm just going to touch on them really quickly without getting too deep into it. But first of all, what is abnormal versus normal? Who defines abnormal behavior, right? So clearly the CDC defers to the American Psychiatric Association and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Who defines abnormal behavior on a case-by-case basis? And how does rationality fit with abnormality? So a couple of issues, right? So we know, for example, that previously the American Psychiatric Association used to classify homosexuality as a disease disorder, right? And so there are certainly cases where, depending on the moral or the cultural stance of the society, certain things can be seen as a mental illness or abnormal, and though they might not be seen that way in the future. So, for example, some things that have taken place in the past that were considered to be mental illnesses or at least amoral, things like masturbation in the Victorian era. So the Victorians used multiple techniques or treatments to try and reduce masturbation. Those who continued, boys and young men who continued to masturbate, were considered or branded weak-minded, right? Many remedies were devised to try and reduce masturbation, including eating bland, meatless diets. And so this was actually an approach that was promoted by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who was a psychiatrist in Battle Creek, Michigan. He invented the most bland food he could think of, which was cornflakes. And today, a lot of the cereal that has followed from Kellogg's original invention through the Kellogg Company, what people don't realize is they're eating anti-masturbation food. And then, interestingly, one of Kellogg's patients at the time, whose name was Post, stole his formula and made his own cornflake cereal. And so today, to this day, the two big cereal companies in the United States are Post cereals and Kellogg cereals, right? There are even situations or cases of different societies where incest between boys and adolescent boys was considered completely normal. That's how the younger boys would actually come into sexual they would mature. And if they didn't have those interactions with the older boys, then they actually wouldn't mature sexually. So that would actually be considered inappropriate or abuse to not let those younger boys actually have that contact. And so the idea is that cultural priorities change over time, and that definitely has an impact on what the culture or the society decides is normal or abnormal. So until 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. Masturbation was seen as inappropriate and possibly harmful to health in the 1800s. Polygamy is and has been practiced by numerous societies throughout history, but some societies say that polygamy is wrong, right? It's not appropriate. Okay, so now let's link in the evolutionary perspective. And hopefully here we're going to start tying things together, and we're going to bring it all to a nice narrative and link it all back to the environment and how the environment impacts what we define as abnormal or behavioral or mental illness, and how we actually go about addressing that. So remember from your evolution class, your evolutionary class, that basically species arise through genetic shuffling. So that genetic shuffling, when two individuals get together, their genes mix. That shuffling results in variations in the phenotype or the actual biological structure of the individual that comes out of that mating and that genetic mixing. And we know that variation in biological structure also results in variation in function. So if you've got if you're a giraffe and you've got a neck that is just a few inches longer than the other giraffes around you, then that gives you an advantage in terms of reaching food higher up in the trees leaves higher up in the trees. And so that variation in function could support survival in the present environment. Now, you could be a giraffe that just so happens to be born with a neck that is a couple inches shorter than all the other giraffes around you, and that doesn't lead to an advantage for you. And so that's a disadvantageous variation in biological structure. So it's random, right? It's happening all the time. Sometimes it just works out that it works out very nicely. And so what we see is that this constant shuffling takes place. New individuals are born. Every once in a while, there's an advantage. And more stable environments require less adaptation than rapidly changing environments. So we want to keep that in mind. So think of something like the shark. The shark hasn't really changed fundamentally in 100 million years because the seas haven't changed. So they're so well adapted that any variations aren't giving a major advantage. And then the other thing we want to keep in mind is that other organisms in the environment constitute part of the environment. And so those other organisms can influence whether or not any variation you experience proffers an advantage or a disadvantage. So the physiological adaptations brought about by diverse genetic coding provide an advantage to the overall organism in navigating the environment and supporting survival. And they don't need to support survival until sexual maturation and reproduction. So the game is replication, right? So many conditions we currently refer to as diseases are only considered diseases because the environment in which we live has changed faster than genetic diversity can alter our physiological structure. This is critically important. So the idea is that it takes many replications, a long time of genetic shuffling, many occasions of genetic shuffling, to really get to a point where you'll see a number of variations, and then those get proffer an advantage and they get passed down. The argument here is that human beings have changed their environment so rapidly, like in the past couple of hundred years alone, our environment has changed drastically, that variation can no longer happen fast enough to keep up with how quickly we're changing our environment. And that causes all sorts of interesting issues and conundrums for the way we live and our health. That's the fundamental point. And so I put this chart in here. This is basically a chart of life expectancy at birth across different times in human history. So if we go all the way back 50,000, 10,000 years BC, you'll see that life expectancy at birth is 33. And this is really because of infant mortality, right? So prenatal mortality, postnatal mortality, right? It was a dangerous environment. We didn't have a lot of treatments. A lot of children passed away at a very early age. Now, if you did get to age 15, then you would probably live an additional 39 years or so. So you would make it to the ripe old age of 50, 54. And then we go through time. So you can see that it's pretty consistent over time. The Neolithic age, the Bronze Age, the classical Greece and classical Rome. I mean, you're looking at pretty young life expectancies. And then even if you make it to age 15, you're going to get to 52 if you're in classic Rome. If you're in medieval Britain, if you make it to age 21, you're going to get to age 64, which is pretty good. And then you'll see in 2010, the world average life expectancy at birth is basically double or more throughout all of history. And you'll also see that life expectancy was 71.4 years of age. And so the idea is we've had this massive explosion in population because we've had this massive extension in life expectancy, and that has been a consequence of a lot of our technology and our understanding of human health and the biology and how the way we shape the environment in terms of sanitation, clean water, removal of waste, etc., can really reduce the burden of disease and especially infectious diseases. And so if you haven't seen a chart of human population growth lately, then this is what it looks like. And so you can see that it's this complete L where throughout all of human history, it was this very, 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 very slow growth. And then about 200 years ago, 150 years ago, it just exploded. And so this is the change in the environment that I'm talking about, where genetics, genetic shuffling has not been able to keep up. And so we see this, right? I think there are examples out there of how this massive shift has really changed the way that our bodies interact with the environment and the implications for health. So, for example, sickle cell anemia. If you were, even today actually, in the United States, 1994, so relatively recent, if you're a patient with sickle cell anemia, your average life expectancy is 42 to 48 years. You would have likely lived much, much shorter in prehistoric times. And so with proper treatment and care for the disease and effective care of the patient for themselves, then they'll live much longer than 40 years in today with sickle cell anemia. So it's a disease in our sense of the modern society because of all of the syndromes that it causes and all of the issues that it causes for the patients who have sickle cell disease. But in the past, sickle cell proffered an advantage to those who carried the genes, specifically resistance to malaria, which is one of the top tropical diseases and killed 438,000 people in the year 2015 alone, with 214 million cases. And so when we actually map this out and we look at, okay, the historical distribution of malaria and the historical distribution of the sickle cell trait, there's quite an overlap. And so there seems to be some connection between the two. And we can go to the literature, we can pull out all sorts of different diseases that have genetic origin, right? So looking at something like factor V Leiden, which is an inherited disorder of blood clotting seen in 5% of Caucasians of Eurasian descent. This is an issue with activated protein C. So essentially, the activated protein C is a natural anticoagulant that acts to limit the extent of clotting by cleaving and degrading the factor V in the cascade of clotting. Factor V Leiden is an autosomal dominant condition that exhibits incomplete dominance and results in factor V variant that cannot be as easily degraded by activated protein C. So what you end up with is a hypercoagulability disorder, which is good if you live in the savannah and a tiger or a lion or an angry member of another tribe slashes your arm open or your leg open. You've got a hypercoagulability disorder. You're more likely to clot up and survive rather than bleed out and die, right? So you can see how that would proffer an advantage in a violent society, in a violent world, but it also leads to a problem because what we see is pulmonary embolism and other circulatory issues later in life today with individuals with factor V Leiden. And so in today's modern society where it's less violent, if you do get slashed by a lion or an angry tribe member, you're going to end up in an emergency department and they're going to stitch you up and stop the bleeding. So you don't really need that hypercoagulability disorder anymore. Now it's actually a disadvantage. It can cause clotting later on, which then impacts your health. We see this with things like metabolism, right? So those who are more sensitive to sugars and fat and who have a slower metabolism are more likely to store calories as fat, which is good in an environment of low resources, because if you have famine or you can't get food, those individuals are going to survive, right? Individuals who have a faster metabolism, who can't store fat as easily, are not going to survive if there is a famine. And so, again, if you take yourself back 5,000 years into a situation where people lived very close to the land, they didn't have access to the resources we do today, those people who could survive famine were much more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes. Now today that's a problem because in most countries we have abundant access to calories. Our environment has changed so much that even in the past 100 years we've gone from a relative lack of calories to an overabundance, and that now causes disease problems for those individuals. You even see this in the cognitive realm. And so if you've never heard of the Stanford Marshmallow experiment, it's worth checking out. And it was actually first studied in Trinidad and was picked up. This is where we look at the cognitive ability to delay gratification, the cognitive ability to say, okay, I can have a treat now, or I can wait and get more treat later on. And so when researchers take children aged 4 to 6, they bring them into a lab and they say, okay, you can have this one marshmallow right now, or if you can wait 15 minutes, I will come back and I will give you 2 marshmallows. And so they leave the children alone with this marshmallow, this tasty, delicious treat, and they watch them and they see what they do. And some of them just grab the marshmallow and they eat it right away and it's gone. So there's basically no ability to delay that gratification. Others, they'll look at it, they'll distract themselves, or come up with all sorts of cognitive strategies to not eat that marshmallow so they can get the second one later on. You'll see some of them will sniff the marshmallow and lick the marshmallow, but they won't eat the marshmallow. And so you can see this nice variation in the way that people process information. And what they did was, many years later, they followed up that study. They followed up the participants in that study when they were young adults, and they correlated and they found that those who were able to delay gratification tended to do better in terms of schooling, educational, occupational attainment, income, et cetera, et cetera. So all those critical measures of how we look at current modern life and how well people are doing. Now, the interesting thing about that study is in 2012, someone did a follow-up study and they added one more factor into that study. And what they did was they exposed the children to either a reliable adult or an unreliable adult. And the way they did that was the child would come in, they would meet the adult, and the adult would mention something about playing with a toy. And then they would either give the child the toy or they wouldn't. And what they found, lo and behold, was that when the unreliable adult were trying to make the deal with the children, saying, if you don't eat this marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes, those children tended to just eat the marshmallow because they no longer believed this person. The environment around them had changed or had impacted their cognitive processing so that they no longer were willing to wait because they figured, well, it's not going to happen, so I'm just going to eat the marshmallow now. Whereas the children who were exposed to the reliable adult waited 4 times longer on average for that second marshmallow because now they believed that it would actually happen because the person they were interacting with seemed like a reliable person. So the environmental context is absolutely critical in the way that we process information and in the decisions and the judgments that we make. And that is where I'm headed with all of this. So just as evolution can result in different physical structures, like a long neck on a giraffe or really long legs on a human, it can also impact mental structures of the way we process information. And those are called mental modules in the cognitive literature. And so examples of variation in mental function are actually pretty common if you look into the cognitive literature. So we see it in terms of IQ, we see it in terms of cognitive processing, short-term memory, working memory capacity. We see it even in the way people process information or language information, how they process faces and that type of thing. And so the idea is you have these different cognitive modules for all of these things, way that people process information. And it's a it's a normal curve. So these are where you get certain people and you see them and you see their linguistic ability. You see, like these people are so eloquent and they talk and they give great speeches and they can capture attention. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you see this person they have a really hard time putting their thoughts together, or not putting their thoughts together, but getting their speech out, conveying their message in an eloquent manner. And so we see that across all these different modules. And so this leads to this fundamental hypothesis, or the kind of the big idea, which is that diversity in mental modules results in variations in thought processes and behavior that can lead to a poor fit with the current environment. And this is where it all links back to mental illness. So for example, high anxious individuals, those people who can't sit still, they're really nervous around other people, you know, they're jittery, they can't process information very well. These are the individuals who may have actually provided a survival advantage in the distant past. So when we think about how human beings lived through most of history, we lived in small tribes of 50 to 100 people, and we didn't even have really set places like towns or villages. We really wandered. We followed animals as we were hunter and gatherers. And so each small tribe, right, would follow animals around, and they would try to protect each other, and every once in a while they would come into conflict over resources, and there would be raids that would take place between the different tribes. So it's a very violent kind of way to live, right? And so those individuals who are very anxious, very nervous, those are the people who would actually probably help protect your tribe, because they're constantly on the lookout for danger. They're constantly you know, agitated. They're constantly, they can't sit still for very long, so they're constantly looking around. And so they would be the people, they would be the individual in your tribe who would give the warning call if another tribe was coming in to attack. And so they would actually protect your tribe, and so they would be highly valued in that group of individuals. Now, you take someone like that, even from 5,000 years ago, or a couple thousand years ago, and you put them in a society like we have today, where, as a general rule, we live in a relatively peaceful society. We certainly don't have tribes coming in and attacking us from next door very often or at all. And we don't have danger lurking around every corner. It's a relatively peaceful society. If you want to look more onto how we live in the most peaceful time in human history, then check out Steven Pinker's book. It was published in 2011. So he makes an eloquent argument that we're actually living in the most peaceful time in human history, despite what you see on the news. Those are relatively small number of events, given the fact that there are billions and billions of people on the planet. And all of a sudden, those super anxious, stressed out people who are constantly on edge and looking for danger and trouble are less helpful, you might say, in this current environment. So now they're actually more potentially of a burden than they would be before. And so now we live in a society where it's pretty peaceful. You get up in the morning, you make your breakfast, you go, you commute to work, right? The vast majority of us, we get to work in the morning. We're not getting in fights on the way to work. We're not getting into confrontations. You know, maybe someone cuts us off in our car and we get upset. But as a general rule, we all get to where we're going. There aren't very many physical confrontations. And we go to work and we sit at our desks, or we go to the construction site, or we do whatever we do, and we interact with others around us. We don't have to fight for food as a general rule. You know, we've got our lunch. We have our lunch. We have our coffee, and we get in our cars, or we get in this transit system, and we go home in the evening, and we hang out with our families. It's a very peaceful environment. So those people who are genetically endowed to be really on edge, how do they fit in with that environment? How do they sit still for 8 hours a day and look at a computer screen, or that kind of thing, where they really have to focus? They have to be in the moment here and not distracted all over the place. Those people are going to have a really difficult. It's the same as our children, the kids, right? So okay, you come and sit in this classroom for 7-8 hours a day. If you're fortunate enough to be endowed with the ability to sit and focus, and you're not agitated, you're not antsy around, then that's a really good fit for you. You're going to do well in the environment. But if you genetically were endowed with this and this like constant distraction, looking all over the place, you're going to have a really hard time in our classroom environment that we've constructed in the modern classroom. And so what do? Well, those people aren't to our modern systems, so we need to change them. We need to change those individuals and fit square peg into the round hole, fit them into the way we've structured our system. And so we medicate. We give ADHD medications. We give anti-anxieties. We try to get these people to basically toe the line, to fit into our system. And that is the exact opposite of this idea of saying, this is how these people were actually born. And so to celebrate the diversity, let's actually try to create or structure the environment so that they can fit into the environment, rather than trying to change them to fit into the environment. And so this is where this One Health idea of One Health involves humans, animals, the environment, and all coming together to help individuals fit and to be as healthy as they can possibly be. And so we examine and change the environment around the individual to support better health and resilience. We celebrate the diversity that comes from genetic predispositions, and empowerment, and social justice, and citizen participation. And that all comes in together individuals. And so some of you in this cartoon that has been floating around for a few years on social media. I really like this cartoon. It really drives home the point. We've created this environment, and it's very specific, and we have very specific tests to be successful in that environment. And if you're lucky, you can see the monkey smiling because the test is, okay, you got to climb that tree. So the monkey's like, yes, I lucked out. Unfortunately, if you're the fish or the penguin and most of the other animals, you're in trouble here, right? And so why don't we actually try to create diversity in our environment, or provide or structure our environment and create that take advantage of individuals' strengths, rather than having one model that plays to certain individual strengths if they're lucky enough to have those strengths. And so this is starting to happen. We're seeing this. It's picking up, this idea. If you've ever seen things like IQs now are being utilized. If you've heard of strengths finders, which is this idea of you take this standardized test and it tells you what your strengths are in terms of personality, and then you take those strengths in an occupation or a career that takes advantage of those strengths, and you end up in a career work at all because you're playing to your innate strengths every day, and it's enjoyable for you, and you move far in your career because you're not fighting against something that you shouldn't be, or you're not focused on your weaknesses. And so we had this, right? We had this growing up. I had this growing up where it's like, you can be whatever you want to be, right? This is a free country. It's a free world. You know, all you have to do is buckle down and work hard enough. And I think that's actually the wrong message to be sending. To send is every individual strengths. And so what are your strengths, and how do we find those strengths, and then how do we leverage those strengths and have the biggest impact, or you can have the greatest success, and how do you set your course to take advantage of those strengths so that you have the greatest success, and how do you find the right environment that takes advantage of that, those strengths will fit well with that environment so that you can succeed. And so this is occupational. Okay, you would really be good in this occupation versus that occupation, and also accessibility. So I remember years ago in the province, there was a rule that was set down by the government in Ontario that basically physical disability is this idea that environment isn't conducive to movement, and so actually creates the disability. So if every building was wheelchair accessible, being in a wheelchair would no longer be a disability, right? And so the Ontario government was trying very hard to structure at least the public environment to be as accessible as possible, because then that removes removes most of the issues of can't access certain areas. And so this is the same idea, but now applying it to a mental health field, which is, okay, what are we doing in our environment that actually continues to cause people with mental illness to suffer? Why can't we help them by changing the environment, which then at least reduces the impact of the mental illness? So mental illness does not occur in a vacuum. Social and environmental factors shape thoughts and behavior, and instead of, or in addition to changing the individual, we should strive to change the social and physical environment around him or her. This idea is to better match the more fixed traits of the individual with the environment, rather than changing the individual to fit into the environment. And this is all based on the same principles as public health, right? So the underlying issues that contribute to mental health problems. We're taking a holistic, systems-based approach to understanding behavior. We're looking at evidence-based, research-oriented systems. We're focusing on the prevention of problems at both the individual and community level. And we're promoting diversity and the empowerment of people within their communities. So that the grand theory. Now, of course, it's not perfect. It's not going to solve all mental illness. It's not going to, it's not a magic bullet. There are no such things. But it is, I think, an interesting idea to explore in more detail. And I think it is something that can certainly help in some significant way. Now, it might not be hugely significant, but it's certainly getting us to where I think we need to be. So with that, I'm done with the lecture. And so I think we're going to take some questions and get some discussion going. And I'll pass that over to Satish to take over that section of it. And we'll go from there. I'm interested to hear your thoughts and questions and your feedback.
Thank you, Dr. Wachter. Is Satish still there?
He's not here in the room at the moment. I presume he is just stepped out, but he should be back, or what do you think?
I think he's got a, he has to do an interview. So,
Okay.
we'll wrap up together, you and I. And first of all, so I've heard that presentation or versions of it a couple times through administering these things, and it's always really entertaining, and some folks have said the same in the chat, so thank you for it. We have a couple chats or questions in the chat box, and for everyone who maybe has a question but hasn't typed it yet, there's a chat box which should be in about the bottom right of your screen. You can feel free to type things in there, and I will ask them in order. If you want to come on the microphone, you can raise your hand. There should be a little hand icon, and I can call on you, and you can ask your question directly. Just make sure you've got a working microphone. But let's start off, Dr. Wachter, with this question, and that is, in your opinion, who or what combination of folks should be responsible for this public health issue of mental health? You know, with physical disease, the person who is sick, more or less, is responsible for deciding on treatment, that kind of thing. In mental health, how is that different?
Yeah, so I think, of course, it's always a combination. So the individual is always responsible for their own individual health. So it's like the classic, especially with mental health issues, the individual has to be ready to do the work that is needed. And so sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the individual just might not be ready to actually do what needs to be done. So there has to be, they have to be on board. But I think we also need, everybody needs to be on board. So I think we need to look at public health officials, physicians, public health nurses, nurses, the way we structure the hospital environments, the way we structure the public health system, but then also we have to get governments and policymakers on board. So there's this, it's a little bit of a new idea. It's a couple of decades old, but it's really starting to pick up as well. This concept of health in all policies. And so this idea is one that governments really should always be focused on health as the primary reason for anything that they're engaged in. So we think about this, right? So usually the way governments are structured is you set up your Ministry of Economics, or sorry, your Ministry of Transportation, your Ministry of Health, your Ministry of Education, your Ministry of Agriculture, Food Production, right? And so all these ministries within a government, they all have their mandate. Okay? And so, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do, or what government should be trying to do, is to promote health. So basically to make as good an environment to live and raise a family as they possibly can. And so we want to make sure there's enough food. We want to make sure that the kids are educated well. We want to make sure that people, when they get sick, they're cared for. Public health comes in because we want to make sure that we're preventing people from getting sick to begin with through things like infectious diseases and quality of water and that kind of thing. And so they're all really engaged in keeping people happy, or keeping people healthy, and giving people opportunities, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the problem is that if you are a minister in charge of the Ministry of Health, you might look at all these factors, especially public health factors, that can play a role in driving the health of the population, right? So you could look at water quality, which might have nothing to do with your ministry. It might have to do with public works. You could look at things like, okay, well, there are too many traffic accidents in the country, and so we're seeing very high healthcare costs because so many people are ending up in the hospital because of traffic accidents and they need treatment. So we need to do things to reduce number of traffic accidents, change the design of roads, et cetera, et cetera. We might end up with too many children in hospital being treated because of the way we design our parks and our playgrounds and that type of thing. The problem is that the Ministry of Health can identify all of these things, but the Ministry of Health doesn't control any of them. And so they have to contact the Transportation Department, and they have to contact Parks and Recreation and Services and Public Utilities, and they all have to convince them, no, look, we need to put money here, we need to put money here. And so this idea of health in all policies is that it all should be under the umbrella of the health concept. So all those ministers, when they're working on a daily basis, all those departments need to keep in mind at the back of their minds that really our mission is to protect the health of the public. And I think this is no different, or we could piggyback on this system when it comes to this idea of, okay, how do we adapt the environment to address mental illness? We know mental illness is a massively expensive issue. We know that the human suffering is significantly large, and we also know that we're limited in terms of our treatments and what we can do. So how do we support those individuals? And that could involve things like transportation, housing, social development, right? So there's a great study that was carried out in St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. St. Michael's Hospital is an inner city hospital. A good portion of the patients that they see at St. Michael's are inner city, very poor, low socioeconomic status, in many cases homeless. And so what ends up happening is you have people who need treatment, but they're homeless. So they have no family physician, they have no established connection with the healthcare system. And so what do they do when they need help? They walk into the emergency department. And so you have all sorts of homeless people coming into your emergency department, some for very serious illnesses, many for illnesses that shouldn't be seen in an emergency department because they're not critical and serious. And we know that running emergency departments is incredibly expensive compared to things like walk-in clinics or family physicians. And so what you're doing is you're seeing all of these patients, and you're seeing them in an incredibly expensive healthcare model, and that's costing a whole lot of money. And so they ran a study to find out, okay, what happens if we actually give these people, so we structure the environment so that they have access to good housing that they choose, that they have access to good quality food, that they have access to education and training. So we're structuring all these components of the environment to help these individuals. And they showed clearly that it costs the government, the system, much less to actually spend the money to structure the environment to help these individuals because they stop going to the emergency department where they have to be seen, right? Where they can't be turned away for ethical and moral reasons. And so from an economic perspective, from a government perspective, from a policy perspective, it also makes, we're getting the evidence that it's showing that it really makes sense to focus on this environmental paradigm.
Oh, yeah, excellent. So let's move on to, there was even more kind of facets to that answer than I even originally expected. But let's move on to the next question. And actually, before I do, quick logistical thing. I think that I sent you a webcam request. Do you see that? Just hit OK, because I shut your webcam off for a while because it was choppy. Let's try to get it back on. OK, you're back up. If it gets choppy again, I'll turn it off. But
OK.
And actually, I'm going to I'll stop sharing your screen if I can. And it looks like I can't do it from my side, so I'll just skip it. But let's move on to the next question. It comes from Sophie. And Sophie says, first of all, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. And the question is, I wonder how we can adapt the environment at the level of institutions. For example, mental health problems have been rising in academia, and notably at the postgraduate level. So how would you propose to change the environment of the university?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sophie. Thank you for that. So, I've been talking with colleagues here, especially Dr. Landon here in the bioethics department, about some of these issues. So here at SGU, right, so we have our professional programs, veterinary, medical, nursing, et cetera, and so this is something that I think is an important issue that we need to look at more and more, because they are stressful programs. You come in and you're expected to perform at a very high level, and you're away from family. All those support networks that we know that help have been removed. And so how do we structure the environment so that we can help reduce the stress load of students? So we've been talking about this. I think there are a couple of things that we can do. So first of all, we need to create an environment, a cultural environment of connection and welcoming. And so, and I think we're fortunate because we have it, and we can, but we need to continue to promote it. So I do see among the students that come in, there is a very collegial attitude among most of the students. It's this idea of, hey, we're all in this together. We're here to help each other get through. And I think as faculty members, we need to set that example by showing that we're here to help you get through as well, that we are all in this together. It's unfortunate because you're at that very critical period in your life where you're a young adult. You're supposed to be, going out and starting a family and meeting someone special and having a intimate relationship. And we put you through a program like this, and we say, no, forget about all of that stuff, that biology, your biology wants all of that, and think and turn into basically thinking machines and process all this information and get really good at, learn the information, get really good at taking tests. And so that creates a certain amount of conflict. And so we need to think about, okay, what are we doing? Why, we're causing that stress, and so how do we reduce that stress as much as we can? Is there anything we can do about the programs and the way the programs are structured? Given that we're really guided by the licensing bodies that require certain things to be done for licensure for professional practice. And then also looking at things like, okay, well, setting up the really good social networks, supporting each other as colleagues and friends. And then also looking at the literature and understanding, okay, what helps with stress reduction. So we know things like meditation, yoga, exercise. These are all validated. They've all been shown to reduce stress, to reduce mental illness, to reduce symptoms of mental illness. Setting up support systems like the Psychological Services Center here on campus, setting up support systems that address specifically what you're here to do, which is learning, and so the Department of Educational Services and how to go about picking up better strategies for learning and succeeding in your program, and then also changing the curriculum and setting the curriculum of the program as best as we can so that you're getting as much practice and exposure to the information and practice to what you need to do, which is to write standardized tests, so that when you get to that standardized test, it's old hat to you. You're not going to be as stressed about it because you've had so much experience writing multiple choice questions and going through the material and practice. And so those are some of the kind of initial things that we can do. And I think critically, you'll notice that most of those things are really related to structuring the social environment and the environment, rather than saying, oh, you're stressed out, here, take this pill, or that kind of thing, which I think is good maybe in an emergency, but certainly not the ideal in the long term.
Thank you. Yeah. Moving on down the list from Richard, who says thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. And a question comes from Casey. And Casey says, thank you for the presentation. I agree entirely that changing the environment is a necessary approach to improving mental health in our culture, but I haven't heard much on how to do this. Do you have any specific examples of current programs or organizations actually putting this into practice?
Sorry, you cut out there for a second, John. Could you just repeat? I think it was just the end part. Before any specific examples. Examples of what specifically?
Changing the environment in order to improve mental health. I think kind of we've talked theoretically about what should happen, but it seems like the question is asking for specific examples of who's doing this well.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we're seeing this. It's happening. It's happening slowly but surely. So we're seeing it with the way. So we've had a little bit of again, my experiences in Ontario and Canada. We're seeing a revamping of the mental health system in Ontario just in the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years. It's happening slowly. So, for example, that we used to have very much a medical model for how to treat mental illness or to address mental illness. So we had systems where basically, okay, if you're in a crisis, you come to the emergency department. You come in, you're going to be seen, you're going to be given emergency medications as needed, and then basically the standard emergency system, which is stabilize the patient, and then get them to see their family physician to come up with a better system for how to manage the illness, just like any other illness, really. And then if you weren't in an emergency system, then you would see your family physician, who would refer you to either an inpatient or an outpatient clinic, where you would definitely be seen more from the perspective of, okay, well, how do we get this person better more quickly? So we're probably looking at medications. We're looking at a limited number of sessions if you're going to go into something like psychotherapy, that kind of thing. So we've switched that model a little bit. So even if you look at the way that there's been a complete revamp of the campus for the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, where it's gone from a very medical building to a community system where you've got all the different tiers of treatment in that community system. So you've got the you've got the kind of the acute treatment for the patients that are in crisis. You've got some of the inpatient. You've got some of the outpatient, and then you've got some community living right there, all within the same campus. And so individuals that need support at different levels can get support, and there's a lot of interaction taking place. But I think also we need to change the social environment and the way that people talk about mental illness and the way that people view mental illness. And so I think this is slowly but surely happening as well. So you see things like the Bell campaigns to talk about mental illness, because yes, we need to change the physical environment, and that's the CAMH is an example of that, but we also need to change the social environment. We need to change the way that people perceive the culture towards mental illness, because then that starts to change the way that people overall start to behave in terms of providing support for individuals who are experiencing mental illness. And so we're getting there slowly but surely, even within, down to the family level. So families now, 20 years ago, it used to be, okay, well, we've got someone with a mental illness, and we don't talk about that. We kind of like, Johnny's there in the basement and nobody's seen him for a while, and it's kind of like, yeah. It's now to more and more where people are like willing to be more open and talk about it, like, yeah, my son or daughter, someone in my family is suffering from depression or bipolar disorder or whatever it might be. And so this attitude change where, okay, we can talk about it more, we can be more open about it, because then that leads to all sorts of innovative ways of actually addressing it. It's when we shove it in the closet or under the carpet, then nobody's, first of all, interested, no one's willing to actually start having discussions of how do we change the system, how do we come up with innovative ways to actually support individuals. And we're also, I think, seeing it with education programs. So the example that I give with ADHD, for example, massive explosion in the number of diagnoses of ADHD and then treatments for ADHD in children. Some of it may be legitimate. I think a lot of it is problematic. And so coming up with this idea of, okay, how do we start to structure learning environments, classrooms better, so that we're now helping, or we're now accepting the fact that some of these kids need a lot more runaround time, they need a lot more in and out with studying different topic areas or different subjects, rather than sitting in, okay, we're doing math for the next 45 minutes to an hour, so sit down, solve your problems, and no talking, right? So how do we change it up more? How do we get the kids more involved and keep them moving? So lots of different ways that we can do it, and I think it's happening, but we definitely need to continue to encourage it.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have two more right now. The next one comes from Tremaine, and the question is dialectical behavior therapy a good form of therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really in the best position to talk about specific therapies. I'm going to defer, actually, because I don't have a lot of expertise in specific therapies. I'm more of kind of a policy, a big picture research kind of perspective guy. So I don't want to give you misleading or false information, so I'm going to defer on that one if I may.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, the next question is, it also comes from Sophie. She says, I also wonder, following the logic of living in a less challenging world, if we have any evidence that mental health problems are less prevalent in poor countries where people struggle to survive or find basic access to food, water, shelter, health, etc.
That's a great question. So we do have much less information on mental health issues in developing countries, low-income, middle-income countries, certainly low-income countries. But that might be more of a situation of just we don't have the resources to diagnose and count very well, because remember, the diagnosis is such an issue. And so that often requires professionals with a lot of training to come in and make those diagnoses. And so if we don't have access to a lot of those individuals on the ground, then we're going to have a difficult time with accurate diagnosis. And so we might have a counting issue when it comes to low-income countries. Now, this idea, and this is something that I've been kind of tossing around in my mind for quite a while, which is this idea of the status of, or at least in developed countries, and the fact that we don't have near as much of a struggle to survive on a daily basis as we certainly did at one point many thousands of years ago. So, you know, you're not going to die if you don't get out and till the wheats or the fields today. You know, you're going to be okay. Whereas, you know, even with when we were nomadic tribes, I mean, if the animals were moving, it's like, well, I'm sorry that you're not feeling great today, but if we don't get up and move then and follow the animals, then we're not going to have you know, food to eat to survive. So this idea of, has our modern privilege, has the, I guess, the ease of our modern lives actually made mental illness more prevalent? So it's like, okay, well, I don't need to be like, okay, I got to get up and I got to till the fields all day, and then by the time I'm done, I'm so wiped, I'm going to bed. I don't have time to be thinking about, you know, how the nature of the universe and, you know, what it means to die one day, or, you know, to get depressed, or to get, you know, even if I am anxious, it's like, okay, well, that's okay, you're anxious. We're all here together in the tribe, and we're all going to go out and do work on this field now, and so, you know, come and work with us because we need all hands on deck or we're not going to survive. And so this idea of do we have more prevalent mental illness because we have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of thinking about these deep issues? We don't have to get up and, you know, work so hard, or work to the bone, like 12 hours a day in a field, or you know, trying to herd animals or whatever it is. I don't know. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that question. It's this interesting idea that I haven't really come to a conclusion on at this point.
So that means I think we'll end the conversation with kind of a question, basically, or jumping off point. So that was a good one to end on. Yeah, with that, so all the questions have been answered. I see a few folks in the chat box just saying they enjoyed it, and thank you very much for the lecture. So I'll thank all the students who came on to participate in this lecture, and let you guys know that we'll see you again next month. Looks like the presentation will be towards the end of August. And I'll also thank Dr. Waker for coming on and spending the 2 hours with us. Really appreciate it, Dr. Waker.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Have a good one, guys. See you next time.
Bye.